To wrap up our section on coevolution, we're going to talk about some complex and very cool interactions that occur in coevolutionary relationships. Now, we've already looked at some complex ones that had three members, but there really are these things that for a long time went unnoticed and then even unexplained. And now in the context of interactions between species and the evolutionary pressure that they put on one another, we understand them much, much better. So our first example is Bayesian mimicry. The classic example of Bayesian mimicry occurs with aposematic or aposematic coloration. So you need to know what aposematic coloration is. It's simply when an organism exhibits a bright color as a means of communicating toxicity. So monarch butterflies are kind of the classic example. And there is some Bayesian mimicry that goes on with monarch butterflies and the viceroy butterfly. But we're going to use an example here with these salamanders because there are multiple species and it's a cool complex species complex with multiple interactions. And that will help us in a later concept when we look at mosaic coevolution. So in this example, there is a species that is toxic. And it's got this kind of dark red back and lighter orangish red belly. And it uses those bright colors as an advertisement. Birds and other species learn to stay away from it. Now, there are two species that mimic this toxic one. And they look very similar superficially. If you look closely, you can see differences. But birds, are using these bright colors to decide whether or not to go after a prey item. And so they've learned either from their parents or from bad experiences to stay away from these colored salamanders. So in Bayesian mimicry, there is a toxic model and then a non-toxic mimic. Now, initially, people thought this was a commensal relationship between the model and the mimic because the model really doesn't have a direct negative impact from having these mimics that look like them. However, once we evaluate it, we realize it actually fits better under the category of antagonism. So it's one of those kind of unusual antagonistic relationships. And the reason is because the birds aren't born knowing to stay away from salamanders this color. Right? They don't just have an instinct, they have to learn it. And so they learn by trial and error, or sometimes parental input will, kind of show them, teach them what to eat, what not to eat. But there's always got to be some kind of testing, right? So birds will attack salamanders occasionally, they'll learn a lesson. But if there are both toxic individuals and non-toxic individuals, the lesson that the birds learn might take a little longer, right? So if you are eating salamanders and every time you eat one you have a bad experience, you get sick or your mouth burns or something like that, you learn to stay away from them really quickly and then you don't eat salamanders anymore. So overall predation levels on a species with only one aposematic individual that's toxic, those predation levels are lower. But if you have an aposematic individual that's toxic and then mimics that are non-toxic, the learning curve is a little bit shallower. It takes longer for individuals to get up to that level where they learn to stay away from salamanders. And so there actually is a net detrimental effect for the toxic model to have mimics that look like it. And the more mimics it has, the more detrimental those impacts are. So remember, with Bayesian mimicry, it really is an antagonistic relationship between the model and the mimic. Okay? Now, monarch butterflies and viceroy butterflies are another good example of that. It's just a simple one-to-one. There's only one toxic model and one mimic, but still, a Bayesian mimicry is antagonistic. Now, there are other types of mimicry also, and we're going to learn about Mullerian mimicry. So Mullerian mimicry is this really cool, results in these really cool species complexes where you can get identical species. Well, identical is the wrong word because the populations are different, but you can get two members of the same species that look very, very different from one another, but yet they look similar or maybe even nearly identical to a different species that lives in their same area. So this diagram here, I'm going to explain it to you. On the top row, so that one, and on the third row here, this one and this one, those are all species A. They are all part of the same species. They can breed with one another. They look different because they come from different areas of the Amazon rainforest. And so it's just like in humans, we have different genetic diversity in different areas. The ones in row 2 and row 4 are from species B. So those two down there, they can all mate with one another if we move them to that area, but they look different because they live in different areas. So far, so good. Now, this one, top left, and the one right below it are from the same area. Different species, they can't mate with one another. There are pre-mating barriers and pre-zygotic barriers. So anyway, they can't mate with one another. From a different area in the Amazon, this individual lives with species B. So notice that they look somewhat similar. The mimicry is not perfect, but they've evolved to look somewhat similar. And then here the mimicry is nearly identical, but species A, species B from a third region, species A, species B from a fourth region. So within these areas, just by chance, changes have occurred, and when they occur that make them both look like one another, that's a benefit. Now, the reason this is a benefit is because both species A and species B are toxic. So there's aposematic advertisement going on here, but that advertisement is different in different areas of the Amazon. But they're saying, stay away from me, I'm toxic. But when they say it together, it benefits, because when two toxic species look like one another and they both have some aposematic warning, the predator learns to stay away from them more rapidly. And so the overall burden on any one of those species is lower because they have a partner species, basically, that is advertising the same signal. So this is a mutualistic relationship. And actually, it's convenient. It's named after a person. They didn't do this on purpose, but the naming is somewhat convenient. If you remember Mullerian mimicry, MU is mutualistic, that will probably help you remember this interaction. Bayesian mimicry is antagonistic. Okay, so you should know those two types of mimicry and make sure you know what type of relationship each one represents. Now, we can also get some very cool examples of complex mixes of Bayesian and Mullerian mimicry. And the old honeybee wasp coloring is a perfect example of this. Now, I was trained in entomology, and much of my research still revolves around insects. And so I learned insect identification, and I can do most groups fairly well. So I will be out sometimes at a picnic, and there will be an insect flying around with black and yellow stripes. And my daughter, who had a bad experience when she was young, will sometimes be nervous. I can tell she's nervous. And I will often identify it, and if it's a bee, we'll shoo it away. But if it's not, I'll say, this doesn't comfort her a whole lot, but I'll say, hey, you don't need to worry, it's just a fly, it can't sting you. And she'll say, what do you mean? It looks like a bee. And I don't often say it, but I say, oh, just trust me, it's a bee. It's a fly. I don't say, oh, it's a Bayesian mimic of a bee, but we have lots of them. So on the left-hand side, we have a honeybee, a wasp, and then down here a bumblebee. You may be familiar with those, and you look at them and you can identify them. But if they're flying around or moving, it's basically the color that you're looking at. If it's yellow and orange with black stripes, or vice versa, I don't know which is which, but if it's yellow and orange with black, then usually you say, oh, warning, stay away, and you get nervous, and that's a Mullerian system, because they all look somewhat similar, and they're all benefiting from that learned response to stay away from black, yellow, and orange striped things. However, these on the right-hand side are all non-stinging organisms. That's a fly. This is actually a moth. It's a very close mimic of the wasp here. And here's a bumblebee mimic that is another fly. And there are actually many, many different types of flies and moths and even some other organisms that mimic ants and wasps and bumblebees. And so these are Bayesian mimics of the aposematic ones, because they don't have a sting, they're not toxic, they just are looking dangerous. They're advertising, it's like false advertising. And so we have these complex mixed systems with some Mullerian mimicry going on and Bayesian mimicry going on also. And so with these really complex systems, we can get a very different range of coevolutionary responses. And so we call this Mosaic Coevolution. So if you lived in an area where there were only toxic models and all Mullerian mimicry, then there are going to be different evolutionary pressures on you than if you live in an area where you are the only toxic one and there might be 3 or 4 or 5 models. And the same thing is true for other coevolutionary relationships too. So in some areas we might have a species of moth that is pollinating a flower, but maybe in another area they have to compete with other moths, or the flowers aren't as abundant, or there's some other thing trying to eat the flowers but not pollinating them. And so evolutionary pressures are going to be different. And so if we identify different populations that are geographically separated from one another, the evolutionary forces acting on the Selway River population might be very different from the ones in the Spokane area. And so we would need to evaluate all of the ecological interactions and figure out what the evolutionary pressures are. And so mosaic coevolution increases overall diversity of a population. And it can even be a driver for speciation, because if you have one population undergoing pressures in one way and a different population in another area undergoing pressures in another way, that drives them apart and makes them genetically distinct, and eventually may be one of the major factors in their speciation. Now, there are some other complicated interactions that we see in coevolutionary events. And the last little discussion I want to have is talking about the evolution of culture and genes, and culture and genes back and forth. Now, typically when we say culture, we think of humans. So let's just define culture and make sure it's clear what we're talking about. Culture is a set of behaviors that is shared by a population. It's a regional thing, right? So our culture in South Texas is different than our culture in China. And many behaviors of complex organisms, humans are a very extreme example, but many organisms do this. Our behaviors are influenced by the culture in which we grow up. And so if you take a baby born in South Texas and move them to Japan before they learn language, they're not going to grow up speaking Spanish or English, right? It's not like it's coded into their genes. They learn that from their culture. We learn how to dress, how to act, how to talk, all from where we grow up. So that, in a way, is not inherited in our genetics, but it is inherited. It's passed on by our parents and our larger environment. Now, other organisms than humans have culture also. So, for instance, rats basically teach their babies how to survive. Now, they do come with a lot of instincts, and it's maybe more instincts in rats. If you let a baby rat on its own, it can probably survive, but it will do much better if mom and dad are there to show it how to hide, where to find food, what to avoid. All of those things are useful from parents. And the more complex a species is, the more potential there is for culture. So for instance, we have some really cool examples of killer whale culture where certain pods grow up learning how to hunt seals, and they teach their babies, and they rely primarily on seals for their food. But in other areas, they learn to hunt salmon, and they teach their babies, and their main dietary caloric source are salmon. And others really do, as the name implies, hunt whales, although that's a little less common. But they can learn all sorts of complex behaviors about how to survive and take advantage of those different resources. So cultural transmission is when that behavior gets passed from one generation to the next. And it's not genetic, right? We don't have English programmed into our DNA, but we have the capacity to do the level of culture, the complex culture in which we survive. And humans are incredibly complex. So culture and behavior gets passed on, but it's not coded into our genetics. We can relearn it rather rapidly. But this means that culture, in a way, can evolve just like DNA can. It gets passed on. The next generation may modify it, change it. The things that people really like, or for whatever reason are more common than others, they get spread around more frequently. And so we can get, really, it's kind of like mutations. So we could look at, for instance, the Korean band phenomenon, right? So K-pop, right? We could look at that as a mutation of the original boy band, that started in England. It's a combination of that and Korean culture and a bunch of other things also, right? But we can look at that, and we can look at culture evolving much like genes do. But remember, even though it's not directly coded into our genes, it does have the capacity to change, and one generation can have an impact on it, and then the next one may have something very different. And so culture can evolve, but it's a little bit different than genetic, but it is part of biological organisms, animals, really, that's what we're talking about, animal behavior, right? And so it's important that we understand that and evaluate that. Okay? And also we need to realize that genes can have an impact, even if it's indirect, on the culture. So we have to have basic capacity. Right? So birds are not going to learn how to sing Barry Manilow. Well, some actually can, or at least close. But certain birds have a certain vocal range. And so they can't do certain things, but within the capacity for what they're given, their genes can guide and direct what's possible culturally. And so different complex songs may then be able to evolve to transmit different and communicate different signals in different birds. And then that culture can impact the genes, because birds that have a better song, if they have genes that are more complex for their brain because they can do that, that might drive the evolution of brain complexity. And so culture affects the evolution of genes, and genes affect the evolution of culture. And in your book, there's this example of how they've studied this and studied the change of it from, being passed on from father to son, and how there is a correlation, even though there's a lot of diversity and spread, but how that can be passed on from one generation to the next in birds, or really any other organism that has a culture. And then as one last bit of information that you need to know, the basic unit for genetic evolution, right, for inheritance from one generation to the next, and the possible for mutations to change it, that basic unit we call a gene. Well, in the 1970s, a behavioral biologist who was studying this transmission and evolution of culture realized that it was much the same way. And he came up with a name for a unit of cultural inheritance. And you already know it, but today we use it in a much more limited use. It doesn't apply as widely as it was meant to originally. So the word meme, right, M-E-M-E, a meme, which now we just use for a short little video thing that everybody knows, a picture or some words on it, or a little GIF or something like that. Right, that's a meme, and they go viral and everyone knows it. They explode and then get transmitted around the globe today. Well, originally meme was used for any element of behavior, any element of culture that could be passed on. So K-pop could be a meme, right? A wedding, or like bar mitzvahs or quinceañeras, or whatever ceremony, that element, we could think of it as a meme. It gets passed on from one generation to the next, change. So really the word meme originally had a much wider definition, and in scientific contexts is still used that way. But it's become so popular, and the definition has gotten so narrow, that outside of evolutionary biologists, if you say meme, people are going to immediately think of, cats or Kermit the Frog sipping tea, right, or something like that. So just know that meme in a biological context has a wider usage and can refer to any unit of culture that can be passed from one generation to the next.